So hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. I'm Paul D'Ambrosio, and I teach Chinese philosophy at East China Normal University. Today, the 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Project is very happy to host Deborah Sommer and her talk, Unusual Depictions of Confucius. We also want to thank Professor Tim Connolly for chairing this session and Professors Jing and Dan Sarafinas for providing comments. I'd also like to remind everyone that we have more talks scheduled next year. So this will be the final talk for this sort of academic year. And then starting in September, we have a talk scheduled every month all the way through to next May. And there's also a couple of seminars coming up, so you can check out our website for more details. So the 四海为学 project hopes to distinguish itself from some of the conventional practices of contemporary academia. As posted on our website, we are not interested in male peacocks and jerks or in any forms of egoism or self-promoting. Although I'm sure someone will post an advertisement or two in the chat later on. We don't really like that either, but that's okay. We also hope to curb other forms of aggressive and sort of look at me, I'm smarter than you type of attitudes that often happen in academic exchanges. 四海为学 hopes to accomplish this change in academic orientation by encouraging productive communication, humble discussions, real questions and responses, and generally collaborative learning together. As many of us know all too well, miscommunication or missed communication can have disastrous results, from ordering the wrong food to starting wars. So with the goal of fostering real, honest, humble exchanges and open communication, the 四海为学 project encourages unselfish, anti-egoist, don't be a jerk, and let's actually try to learn together. Here we have less of an emphasis on learning about Chinese philosophy and focus a little bit more on learning from Chinese philosophy. Although I think for your talk, we're doing something a little bit different, right? Maybe more like learning about how some people have thought from or something. But anyways, I think it's very much, Professor Deborah Summers, I really think your talk is very much in the spirit of exactly what we're trying to do here. So thank you for being here. Today, the chair is Professor Tim Connolly. Instead of telling you all about Tim academically, I will just tell everyone that Tim personally is a really great guy. And I've worked on a few different projects with him. Maybe we're doing some more. And so Tim, thank you very much. And I'm going to let you take over from here.
All right, thank you, Paul. I'm very happy to chair this session today. And to begin, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Professor Deborah Sommer, who will be giving what is the 11th lecture in the Collaborative Learning series. Professor Sommer is currently professor and chairperson of the Religious Studies Department at Gettysburg College, located in the state of Pennsylvania in the US, where I also am now. Her research focuses on pre-modern Chinese intellectual history and religion, with a special interest in notions of ritual, body, and self in the Confucian tradition. She's the author of many publications. Personally, I first remember encountering her work more than a decade ago when I was a novice to the field of Chinese philosophy. And there was a new book out by Roger Ames called Confucian Role Ethics. And in one of the chapters of that book, he discusses Professor Sommer's scholarship on the body in early Confucian texts as one of the inspirations for his views about personhood and agency that he develops in that book. So since going out and reading the article in question, I've had the opportunity to learn from several other works by Professor Sommer, including her discussion of concepts of the body in the Zhuangzi, and also her article, Ritual and Sacrifice in Early Confucianism. All right. One of Professor Sommer's most recent papers as she mentioned just a few minutes ago, is just out in the new Oxford Handbook of Confucianism, which was published, I think, just a month or two ago. So thank you, Professor Sommer, for being here today. We're looking forward to your lecture, and I'll now turn it over to you.
Thanks very much for those introductions. So you guys can all hear me okay? I see, yeah, I can see just Paul's image up here. So thanks very much again for allowing me to participate and share some of my research and some of the fun I've had in collecting different images of Confucius over the years. My interest in this topic of visual depictions of Confucius actually began back when I was doing my dissertation, when I ended up stumbling across an iconoclastic controversy over depictions of images of Confucius that happens in the mid-Ming. And since then, I've been looking at ways in which the figure of Confucius has been constructed and deconstructed over the centuries. This image that you see in front of you is one of these modern, but 20th century Western depictions of Confucius, who you probably won't recognize. He's depicted here, this little bump on his head, as described by Sommer in his Records of the Historian, and others said that Confucius has this little bump on his head. You also see in this little tiny a meat product collectible card, a series of cards by this company called Liebig that existed in the early 20th century. Two little guys here doing some Buddhist meditation. That's Confucian, I suppose. There's a throne in the back here that indicates imperial power, also thrown into this series of ideas about Confucius. Lots of random Chinese characters here and there on the throne and here. This image is just one of like thousands really, that shows some of the ways in which different cultures have mushed together lots of different themes and unconsciously put together, in many cases, different ways in which this figure of Confucius is created. So we'll look at some of these from early times in China up until the 20th century, into the very modern times. So I'll try to keep track of my time and let me know if I'm running out of time, but I'll try to go through the materials and introduce as many different kinds of Confuciuses as possible. Some from Tibet, mixtures of Tibetan and Chinese culture, Western and Chinese culture, and lots of others besides. So I note that Confucius is always under construction. It's an idea that's always under construction. When we think of the figure of Confucius, we probably think of this old guy standing on a pedestal somewhere. But this is probably a very modern, actually, construction of the image of Confucius, a figure of Confucius. This is taken at the Shanghai Confucian Temple way back in 2004. Presumably, maybe it's still being rearranged to some extent. Who knows what's going on there? But in the different ways that we think of Confucius, I used to just, without thinking, think of Confucius as this old guy. And then when I started doing dissertation work, began to realize, like, no, that was no idea that anybody knows what Confucius ever looked like at all. And more recently, I've been looking at different texts and different actual visual images to try to find out, well, what did Confucius actually look like? Or all you can say is what people thought that Confucius actually looked like, because we don't know for sure. I always turn back to a passage from Gu Jiegang, who lived in the late 19th or 20th century, and he has this famous lecture on the notion of like who Confucius is and what he looks like. And he says that every age has its own Confucius, and each age there are different kinds of Confuciuses, several kinds of Confuciuses. And he says that the figure of Confucius always changes according to whatever people think of him, how we imagine him. So it's actually, Confucius is a projection of our own imagination, our own political, philosophical, religious, spiritual, social needs. So as we look at this notion of Confucius, I just ask you to consider or reconsider everything that you ever thought that you maybe have visually imagined Confucius to look like in your mind's eye, and to just consider Gu Jiegang's notion in his famous lecture about the many different kinds of Confuciuses that exist in each age. Now I'm focusing on unusual depictions of Confucius in this talk, and this one maybe doesn't seem unusual to you. It's from Nanjing, looks like this really typical standing figure of an old guy, but it's actually unusual, and then it probably isn't Chinese at all in terms of its origins. So what is unusual about this, when we think about it, we see that it's first that it's outdoors and it's exposed to the weather and to the gaze of ordinary people like us. Anybody can look at it. The snow on his head in the winter, and he's subjected to all sorts of changes of climate. It's also standing. This is an indication of a lack of status usually in the Tang Dynasty. There are huge controversies over which depictions of which person in the Confucian temple should be depicted sitting and who could be depicted standing. So if you're depicted standing, it meant you were a person of lower status. Higher status people get to sit. So there's something wrong with the image in that sense. Another problem with it is that it's solitary. He's there all by himself. And usually if you have status, you have other people with you. You're flanked by your disciples, or you're flanked by, bodhisattvas if it's your Buddhist figure. So this phenomenon of having these public images out of doors like this, now this is not typical of traditional Chinese images at all. So if you're like the statue of Confucius at the Guozijian, if it snows in October, then you're subjected to snow and other kinds of things like that. Not exactly something that you want to happen to sacred images of this age. So the notion of having these outdoor public figures of, anthropomorphic depictions of people, this is like largely a Western phenomenon. I can't think of that many examples in China, other than, cave grottos or cliff grottos, where there are images that were set up like this. Here we have the King of Sweden in Estonia, who's depicted outside, pigeons landing on his head, subjected to the elements. So this is a kind of a Western phenomenon, but it's not largely a Chinese one at all. Obviously, the more typical Chinese depiction of Confucius, or at least in late imperial times, since a lot of times we don't know what was going on in earlier times, is, a seated figure. He's in this nice little cozy alcove in some nice temple somewhere. There's depictions of his followers, or Mencius or Jushi or whomever on the side, flanked with lots of people. So he's sitting, doesn't have to stand. And he has this is a very different kind of understanding of how images should be treated. So again, this is just one type of image. There's a later imperial depiction of Confucius, maybe dates to as early as the Song, in the ways that he's depicted with the diadems in the front of him in this kind of seated posture. But again, it's very difficult to determine the dates of a lot of these. This is the ancestral statue of Confucius associated with the southern Kong in Xuzhou in Zhejiang province. It's an interesting phenomenon, this whole southern Kong clan. In recent times, in the early 2000s, the image or the person of Confucius was invigorated for that particular clan. And this temple was sort of not reconsecrated, but there are huge ritual reenactments and developments in the ritual system for this particular temple that involved depictions of Confucius. So what does Confucius look like if we go back to the Analects? Can you figure out anything? No. Was he handsome, good looking? Was he tall or short? We don't know anything really about his physical features. If you go through the Analects, you won't find anything about his specific physical features at all. So it's not that important. What is important in the Analects is his conduct and demeanor. This at least is especially important in book 10, which is actually probably not about Confucius at all. It's probably this little ritual handbook that's actually, for all intents and purposes, an independent text that somebody stuck in the Analects at some point that describes court behavior. Actually not court rituals, since the term ritual is never actually mentioned there. It's basic protocols. And in the passages in book 10 and a few other passages throughout the Analects, the figure of someone who we're supposed to think is Confucius is described as he goes up and down the stairs, as he's actually like breathing, he's holding his arms, as he's moving around. It's like a cinematic depiction of somebody in action. So there's a concern in the Analects with your demeanor, how you look, how you hold yourself, how you carry yourself. But whether you're pretty or you're ugly or you have a big nose or little nose, that doesn't really seem to be important in the Analects at all. Then what of other texts that appear a few centuries after the death of Confucius? You start to see his countenance develop in ever greater detail over time. In the Shunzi, for example, There's a chapter where Confucius appears. It's called the Fei Xiang, against physiognomy. And Confucius is actually just a cipher that is used as a way to critique the whole process of physiognomy. In the Zhuangzi, there's a few terms that are not really clear that describe him as maybe having weirdly set ears or kind of a hunchback. But again, it's his behavior that's important in most of those early texts. Around the time of the records of the historian, the Sima Qian's Shiji, and there are a number of other texts where Confucius becomes associated with physiognomy. He becomes physiognomized by other people. That appears as early as Shunzi. And he starts physiognomizing other people himself. So develops a great concern about people's physical features around the early Han. He becomes more clearly described as the years move on. Sima Qian puts together this hodgepodge of ideas about the purported features of Confucius. And he says, he has this thing on his head, hard to figure out what it means. According to some, he's like kind of tall. And there are other different ways in which he describes different aspects of Confucius's appearance. Sima Qian really wants to see, he has this yearning to actually see Confucius. He uses the word jian, like to see. He says, oh, I long to see Confucius. And he sort of creates this vision of Confucius in his hagiography of Confucius. In terms of actual like physical images, like sculptures or reliefs or paintings, the earliest extant ones that I know of date to the Han. There's one that's been recently discovered in the tomb of, was it Hai Hun Ho, that dates to the Han. That supposedly depicts Confucius, although the images I've seen of that, I can't really figure out who it is. There seem to be two figures in that particular lacquered dressing mirror, whatever it's interpreted to be nowadays. But the earliest known images date to the Han. The actual images date to the Han. What is unusual about those images from the Han is that Confucius is almost always depicted with other people, and he's not the most important of them. He's depicted with at least one of two people, the much older Laozi and a much younger 7-year-old child, a child prodigy called Xiangtuo. Xiangtuo is wildly important in a lot of early depictions of Confucius, and you'll even find him in almanacs today. But I think he was replaced by Yanhui sometime in the Song. And then these Han depictions, he's read as being middle-aged in the sense that you have the much older Laozi and the much younger Xiangtuo, so Confucius is somewhere in the middle. And he's a student, and he's not a teacher in those particular depictions. Confucius actually becomes old only much later, maybe in the Song. Again, it's difficult to tell. When his iconography becomes visually merged with that of the Buddhist layperson Vimalakirti, whose iconography is indebted probably to Sogdian funerary art. So let's look at some of these Han depictions of Confucius. You're probably familiar with the Wuliang shrines, or maybe not, I don't know. If you can tell who Confucius is, just looking at this right away, my hat's off to you. I don't know if you can tell which one Confucius is in this complex register of narratives in this series of Han bas-reliefs. Right here, we see the figures of Confucius and Laozi. Confucius's figures, his features rather, are totally generic. Everybody pretty much looks alike in many ways in this Han bas-relief. And the only way you can really identify people is through certain iconic things that they hold, they carry, or that are associated with them. Sometimes there are cartouches that give their names. So we see this is Confucius, for some reason holding birds. I don't really know why. This is Laozi, who's depicted with a cane to suggest his age. And this is this weird little figure of Xiangtuo, who has this little wheeled toy. Now, Xiangtuo is a figure who appears in a number of like Warring States text. Just like there's a line or two here or there that says, oh, Xiangtuo was Confucius's teacher at the age of 7. It's like, where does that come from? But by the Han, he becomes one of the most important iconographic companions of Confucius. Sima Qian, in the records of the historian, in his biography of Confucius, combines a number of texts, passages from the Analects, passages from the Li Ji, passages from other texts, and he creates this figure of this relationship, the pseudo relationship, the pseudo meeting between Lao Tzu and Shangtuo and Confucius. And it's interesting how it combines a lot of these passages to convince visually the reader that these three figures met at some point and had a conversation about things. This little kid is a very interesting figure, and he becomes Confucius. He becomes absorbed into Tibetan culture and has a very long relationship with Confucius, a very peculiar one. And he also appears in Dunhuang. So we'll see what's going on with that. This is a detail of the previous image. You have the figure of Confucius here, his face, Lao Tzu's face. Can't really tell them apart very much. He's holding some birds. Don't really know why. This is the figure of Shangtuo. Has this little cute little hat and his little wheeled toy that indicates that he's a small child and he's still sort of playing, but he's Confucius's teacher, according to some Warring States text. And this is the figure of Lao Tzu with his cane. So a lot of these figures were drawn very generically in this Han bas-relief art, sometimes with compasses. So we don't really have any kind of way of knowing what Confucius looked like through these images themselves. They're there to tell the story, and it's the story that's important and not so much the actual features of the figure. So the Confucius and Shangtuo story becomes very popular in the Tang Dynasty. It develops perhaps in Central Asia, perhaps under influence of Tibetan cultures. The story exists in multiple versions at Dunhuang, where it's more popular than the Analects. So Dunhuang contains a lot of texts, they're especially Buddhist texts, and the text that I'll show you probably was created in Buddhist context. So in this tale is called Kongzi Shangtuo Xiangwen Shu. Confucius and Shangtuo mutually ask one another questions. Shu is like document or manuscript. So there's a series of riddles that is presented to Confucius and Shangtuo. Confucius is going down the road and he runs into a child who's playing in the middle of the road, making a little house. And Confucius says, "Hey, little boy, get out of the road." And little boy says, like, "I've never heard of like the road and a building getting out of the way for a person. It's always the person who gets, out of the way of the building on the road." So this child engages in a discussion, kind of a test of wits with Confucius. And there's a kind of like a Zen master, Zen disciple riposte that goes on between them. And in these riddles, the child always wins and Confucius always loses. So in some versions of the story, it sort of just ends with Confucius saying, "Oh, this little child is so smart and so wonderful." But then there are other versions of the story. There's a section that continues in a prose version where a jealous Confucius is called the master of Fuzi. He gets really angry. He hunts the child down and he kills him in cold blood. This is like Confucius as a homicidal maniac. It's quite a fascinating story. So if you go to the Dunhuang project materials of the British Museum, you can find the copies of this text. This is the Kongzi Shangtuo Xiangwen Shu. These little booklets that were probably created by young people who were residing at Buddhist schools when they're practicing their characters. This is obviously someone who's just learning how to read or to write Chinese, and he's tracing out the story of Confucius and this young boy meeting, and there are all these riddles, and Shangtuo wins this test of wits, and Confucius, depending on where the story ends, either says Confucius is a great guy, it says Shangtuo is a genius little kid, or if you read the longer version, Confucius kills the little kid. But there are many versions of this in Dunhuang, again, more than the Analects. That's quite a fascinating story. So this is the part of the version where Confucius kills the little kid. Confucius gets angry and he says, "I'm going to hunt that little kid down and I'm going to find him. I'm going to show him who's who. He thinks he's so smart." So I just highlighted a few passages. This is a very long tale. And it says the master drew his sword and he was slashing wildly. And paired up 2 by 2, there are rows of students in an underground temple, underground cave, studying, reciting texts. They were not because they had turned to stone. But then Confucius still keeps slashing, the blood is pouring. And now Shangtuo, he eventually becomes wounded. For some reason, he's not able to stay turned to stone. He's almost dead. He turns his head and looks towards his mother in some distant place where his mother is. And he says, "Take my red blood that fills this jar. Take it home and keep it there for 7 days or more." So the mom gets the jar of blood. She's totally freaked out. She throws it onto the manure pile. And then from that manure pile grow these huge bamboos that then grow up and scare Confucius. There are so many interesting things religiously that take place in the story, that all the sort of different kinds of pollution and different kinds of transgressions, that is just a wonderful story to look at from the perspective of the interaction probably between Buddhist cultures, who are like these Buddhist students. They're probably interested in maybe poking fun at Confucius a little bit. It's kind of maybe a rival for them, and to seeing what happens with this bizarre story of this child Shangtuo. The story of the relationship of Shangtuo does not end at Dunhuang. The materials there would have dated maybe to early Tang to Song maybe. But the story of Confucius and a Shangtuo-like figure goes off into Tibet. The connection between Tibetan cultures and Chinese cultures is on display in Dunhuang materials very literally graphically, because you can find texts that are written on Chinese characters on page X, and then in Tibetan script on page Y, just a few pages down. So if you go to the International Dunhuang Project, you can see how at Dunhuang, if you look at this Tibetan manuscript TIB 130, for example, pages 1 and 2 are written in Tibetan, and this has to be turned the other way, but just to show you that it's written in Tibetan. But if you take the same manuscript and you go to pages 11 recto to 12 verso, it's written in Chinese, voila. So you have literally people writing in Tibetan and in Chinese in the same text. I don't know if they're written by the same person, it could be, or maybe not, maybe they're written by different people. But you have this mixture of cultures collected in the Dunhuang materials. And of course, Tibetan culture controlled the area around Chang'an during sections of the Tang. So it's very likely that in this place, you find combinations, and I don't know how this might have happened, in which Shangtuo eventually becomes merged with a Tibetan figure who's called Tompa Shenrab. So let's see what's going on with that. So Confucius travels to Tibet, so to speak, and the tale of Confucius's meeting with the child Shangtuo that exists in Warring States text enters Tibetan Bon and gets another life of its own. And the identity of Shangtuo merges with the main Bon spiritual figure, kind of like the Bon Buddha, called Tompa Shenrab. And Confucius becomes Tompa Shenrab's father-in-law, according to some versions of the life of Tompa Shenrab. So the Confucius that goes to Tibet is the Confucius of the Chenlei Shu, the early medieval apocrypha, whatever you want to call this mantic text. It's not the Confucius of the Analects. So it's the Confucius of the Chenlei Shu. The Confucius of those texts is the Confucius who has all sorts of cosmic symbolism contained within his body. He's a master of ritual. He's a master of divination. He is able to prognosticate the future, and he's able to do all these wonderful things. And that's the version of Confucius that goes into Tibetan culture. So you'll see even modern day Tibetan scholars will look at depictions of Confucius in Tibetan lore, and it's well known in Tibet, oddly enough, I found out. And the Confucius in Tibet is like weird to them, because like this isn't the Confucius of Chinese culture. It's because it's the Confucius of Han Chinese culture. It's not the Confucius of the Analects that continues in Chinese culture after the Chenlei Shu become less popular. So look to see what happens with Tompa Shenrab. Some of my friends translated the Chinese characters for me, or translated this to make it easier to explain what's going on with this whole Confucius and Shangtuo in Tibet sort of story. So in Tibetan Bon, Confucius becomes this follower of Tompa Shenrab, and their encounter is depicted in a tanka and a painting at the Musée Guimet in Paris. There are a series of tanka paintings that depict the life of Tompa Shenrab, like the great deeds of the Buddha, 12 great deeds of the Buddha. There's also kind of like 12 great deeds of Tompa Shenrab. Usually the 9th image of that series is his encounters, Tompa Shenrab's encounters with Confucius. So we'll look at that. I went to Paris just to see this. It was so interesting. So I have some details from it. And this is what it looks like. This is the tanka that depicts Tompa Shenrab's, or the sort of Tibetanized Shangtuo, his various encounters with Confucius. It's a really complex image, and I have like a whole separate presentation on what's going on in this image, because there's a lot of stuff happening here. But this is the tanka that was acquired in Songpan, a kind of northwestern Sichuan, back in the early 20th century, and it's been in the collections of the Musée Guimet since then. So this material is really not known outside of China. I've presented it at Zhongshan Daxue years ago, and this is all new to people there. So what's going on in this image? I'll just point out some of the image sections that we'll look at two details. We'll look at one little detail up here, which shows Confucius bringing forth some demons using magic. And then there's another series over here where Confucius is working with meeting this figure, this Shangtuo-like figure. The other thing is going on, Confucius is being born here. There are other places. There's another birth story up here. There are things that are, in my opinion, derived from or associated with or parallel with the Shangji Tu, or the visual narratives of the life of Confucius literature that was created in China. So a lot of the snippets of those items visually are brought into this image. This whole section here, this is not Confucius here, but we'll look at this particular section here and the one up here that shows Confucius with encountering this figure Shangtuo. So this is the Confucius is called Kongzi in Tibetan, and I was quite surprised to find out that my Tibetan friends, like, yeah, they know, they've heard of this person called Kongzi. I said, like, that's like Confucius, and they say, oh, it's Kongzi, who knows what that is? But then this is apparently widely known. I didn't know this, but there are like ritual texts in Tibetan collections by Confucius, so much he is this, diviner using black-headed dogs and things like this to conduct rituals. So who's Confucius in this image? It's this guy here in red. It's got kind of like a turban-like figure, and we'll see another turban in an image later. And he's encountering a figure who will become like a manifestation of Tongpa Shenrao. This is kind of like the child figure Shangtuo. This is Confucius again. This is the same figure again. They're doing a divination down here. In the story of Confucius and Shangtuo in China, they're doing a kind of series of riddles back and forth. And that in Tibetan tradition is understood to be a kind of a divination. And this is also a kind of a divination that they're conducting here. So in this section of this image, Confucius and Shangtuo are doing a kind of divination or a kind of gambling. Gambling also appears in the Chinese story. So we'll just note here that this is Confucius dressed in red, paying his respects to this Tibetan figure. And here he's engaged in a kind of a ritual divination / gambling with this figure. So I don't have time to go into all the many different details of this image, which are quite fascinating, this tanka. I'll just turn it into one more of these to look at the ways in which what I believe is to be the Han apocryphal Confucius, who becomes absorbed into the Bon Confucius. And that will be depicted in the second image that I'll show you from the tanka. And the Han Apocrypha in the Chenwei Shu, in the Mantic text of the Han, there is a Confucius who is described as a master of astral sciences, and he's a master of divination and prognostication and ritual. And lo and behold, in the Bon Confucius, and there's quite a lot of literature on this, he is, lo and behold, a master of astral sciences, divination, prognostication, and ritual. The Han Apocryphal Confucius is born with special writings on his hands and other parts of his body. These are quite mysterious. And in the Bon tradition, he's born with special writings on his hands. In the Han Apocrypha, he's a king. And in the Bon tradition, he's also a king. So where do we see this? It's in this detail that was at the top of that image, where we see this figure here with a turban again, seated, doing some sort of mudras. There's like a tiger here, and like a lion and demon, and a protective bird up here, common in the Bon tradition. In the Han Apocrypha, Confucius is described as having huzhang, tiger palms. That's one of his featured characteristics. And in this tanka, Confucius appears to be, he's got a tiger with him, and with his hands or his palms, he appears to be making mudras. And in a detail of this image, we can kind of see where he's it seems like the artist has tried to suggest motion, that he's doing these mudras of esoteric Buddhism or Bon Buddhism or kind of magic in order to achieve the desired results and to get these demons to come and help him do whatever he has to do. So in this instance, in this tanka, we can see how Confucius becomes absorbed into the Bon tradition, and he's given this completely new iconography. If you looked at this image, you would never tell that this was Confucius. Confucius doesn't drop out of the Tibetan tradition. He becomes known as a someone who can kind of conduct rituals or help you with rituals, predict the future, do divination, so on and so forth. He becomes merged with the character of Manjushri, and I'm indebted to this idea to Ferdinand Lessing on the one hand, and Ferdinand Lessing in the early 20th century described a tanka of Confucius / Manjushri. That's in the Yonghagong in Beijing. This figure in the middle is Confucius. He's got this long arrow here. He's seated on a tortoise. And there are a host of other kinds of animals and symbols around him. And Lessing wrote this article, it's called like Bodhisattva Confucius, in which he describes the content of this image. I'm also indebted to the Russian scholar Andrei Terentiev, who also helped me to understand that, yes, this is understood to be Confucius as Manjushri. And he directed me to a tanka in a Russian collection. This is courtesy of Andrei Terentiev. Confucius again is depicted with this arrow, seated on a tortoise, surrounded with different kinds of magical animals. So Confucius becomes absorbed into the Tibetan tradition, stays there. And Tibetan people, lo and behold, like know this. This is quite new to me, but so yeah, this is something everybody knows. The story doesn't disappear in China either. So if you go to a Chinatown in the US and pick up one of these almanacs, you can see the story of Confucius and Shangtuo. It's called the Xiao'er Lun, the story of the little child, where Confucius encounters this child in the middle of the road, creating this little walled sandcastle in the middle of the road. In this version, the child is not slaughtered. He's just shown to be like a particularly brilliant child. So this story becomes very popular throughout Asia. It's translated to many different languages. I hadn't really paid attention to it very much, but this two-sentence passage back in the various Warring States texts saying that this child was the teacher of Confucius becomes quite popular. So if we look at some of the oldest extant in situ statues of Confucius, three-dimensional images, those can be found in Dazhu, Sichuan, the Sichuan province. It's not that far from Songpan, where the Paris tanka, the Musée Guimet tanka, was originally required. And those oldest extant in situ images of Confucius represent, or they depict, a much younger Confucius than we're used to looking at. It's actually a Confucius that looks more like the Kongzi of the Bon tanka than they do anything we see in modern times. So if you go to Dazhu and you go to the caves that have depictions of Confucius, of Buddhist divinities, and Lao Tzu in another grotto, you'll find an image that looks like this, not immediately recognized as Confucius, but he's has on both sides, he has some disciples in this grotto. There are like 7 or about 8 disciples in total. Confucius is seated in the middle. The disciples stand on either side. There are inscriptions that date it to around the 11th century. And we can see that Confucius has this turban on his head, his cloth cap, and he's a very young person, not even a beard. So we don't know how old he is in this particular image of Confucius. But this is lots of fascinating images in this region of Dazhu, some of which are associated with Confucian traditions. So in the 12th century, in the 1100s in Sichuan, Confucius is still a pretty young guy. And in Hunan, if we look at a modern day depiction of him in the 21st century, he's much, much older. I think these really old depictions probably are indebted to biblical understandings of old people. Also in Dazhu, we see Confucius depicted as a king. This is Confucius in the caves called Miaogaoshan in Sichuan, also in the Dazhu region. Here he's depicted as a king, again seated, his hands in maybe some kind of mudra, maybe just holding a scepter of authority that's been damaged somehow. He was ritually a king since the 8th century, according to all the Chinese texts we have. But here again, we see he's quite young. There's no beard for this particular Confucius. but Confucius gets progressively older through the centuries. So Confucius's teacher is Xiangtuo, this little child. He becomes largely replaced in visual images by his disciple Yan Hui in Song times. I don't have, those are very common images. And if you know, Yan Hui is often depicted really small, almost like a young child or as a very small figure. Perhaps it's because of this legacy of Confucius being associated visually with Xiangtuo rather than Yan Hui for a long time. There isn't any particular evidence that Yan Hui was really small or especially young. I mean, he was a student, but not that young. So then we'll jump over to Confucius going west. We've taken him to Tibet, now we'll take him to Europe and then to North America. So am I doing for time? I have a little bit of time left. So if we take him off to the west, we'll see some of the earliest depictions of him depict him as like a statue. Jesuits and other religious figures from the west were stationed in China, and they created this, it's called the Vede, the Confucius, the Life of Confucius, that was based on was called the Shengqi Tu literature, the sort of Life of Confucius series of images that were very popular in China and are still produced all over the place. And they depict Confucius as a statue rather than a real person. And they depict him as a Western guy. Chinese students, when they look at this, they don't see a Chinese person particularly at all. So the Jesuits would create these sketches, and they would then send them back to Europe to be engraved by other people. And then they'll be published there in many different kinds of publications. The images would be sort of copied back and forth quite a bit, and they're used and reused, and the captions be changed. So the Confucius that Westerners first saw is actually an image of a statue like the one we see at Chuzhou here, seated statue, a little bit more lifelike. We can see his hands and appears to be a human being, but he's not really. Westerners were very much concerned about the whole notion of idol worship. There's like, what are those foreigners doing? Are they worshiping idols over there? Or are they doing something else? So images of Confucius kind of became caught up in that. Sometimes people were happy to see that there weren't any idols on altars to Confucius. This is a sort of festival of the Chinese in honor of Confucius. Somebody, an official, making an offering to an altar where there's just a wall hanging of Chinese characters, as far as we can see, some smoke from incense, random Chinese characters. These are collections of images that often show a lot of anxiety about idol worship. Some of them are pretty gory. Some depictions show people from other countries with, severed heads on the altar, different locations. Confucius is not associated with them. But if we look at a close-up, we can see this official, Qing official, again, nonsense characters, making some offering to calligraphy. No statue here. So this probably would have made the Protestants in Europe feel a little safe when it comes to their understanding or misunderstanding of what Asians were doing. But other images would have given them a lot to worry about. For other images depicted Confucius as an idol in the land of idol worshippers. This is engravings for Portlock's new collection of voyages and travels. Here we see Confucius. Believe it or not, this figure with the pineapple on his head is Confucius, with the 12 sort of philosophers on either side, human beings making offerings of incense to this image, bowing down, doing all sorts of unholy things to the Protestant imagination. Here he's seated next to Amida Buddha, of all things, looking a little bit like a Greek god. Again, nonsense characters on his image in the front. Now, these images were quite interesting because different people, engravers in Europe, would re-engrave them and republish them, and then would often just like change the captions at the bottom. So in one text, this would be Amida Buddha. This would be some other divinity, and they would just change the captions. And it didn't really matter to the person engraving them. They just wanted to sell the books. They had the image, so they just changed the captions. They weren't worried about historical accuracy. Confucian temples became of interest to Europeans as they started to travel a little bit to Asia, or if they couldn't travel to Asia, then they could buy picture books that were collections of travel to Asia. And the temples of Confucius were of interest to Europeans. They're also marketable as curiosities. So you find photographs in the late 19th century of the Guozhijian, the Confucian temple or the National Academy of Taisha, next to the Confucian Temple in Beijing. So it would be in one of these like descriptions of travel in China book that would contain pictures of Confucian temples or pictures of women with bound feet or actual bound feet, sort of like weird curiosity kinds of things. But these were quite popular, and they became absorbed into the advertisements that were used to sell things like chocolate and meat sauce and cigarettes in Europe. So in this little tiny card, which is just about 2 inches tall, you see the Temple of Confucius in Peking here, Beijing, as part of this little chocolate card that would be used to try to get people to buy this particular brand of chocolate as opposed to another brand of chocolate. Again, the fascination with calligraphy, why there are rice paddies in the middle of the Guozijian, I don't know. And the fascination with the official attire of people. So the person who created this little advertisement was looking at an image like this. They were basing their advertisements on their understanding of what this image actually looked like, what this temple actually looked like. And there are a lot of these different depictions of temples that appear in the West. Now, in Europe, we can find a lot of images of Confucius used for marketing of chocolates, of cigarettes, other kinds of things. And he's usually depicted positively as a philosopher, as an educator, and as a benefactor of humanity. Then later, when we look at materials from North America, we'll see that Confucius becomes a sort of a carrier of images of views towards immigrants that were racist, sexist, pretty horrible, basically. But in Europe, I haven't found any negative depictions of Confucius. So we'll look at a few images of those. Again, there are lots of little cards that were collectible cards of different thinkers that were sold. This is one produced in Spain in the 20th century, early 20th century. I don't think he looks particularly Chinese at all, but it gives his dates of birth. We see some like Greek philosophers, other philosophers down here. This is series 24, number 3. And he was part of a series that included figures like Kant, for example, or Voltaire. So we see Confucius appearing alongside the philosophers of Europe. And there are many others besides, people that I'm not familiar with. Well, Descartes, obviously, you've heard of, but there are other lesser known figures that appear in this series. And this is not all of them, but includes everyone from lots of people from ancient Greek times to modern Russian thinkers. So Confucius was one of these, philosophers among philosophers, who was a world leader in human thought in these European understandings of Confucius. In this cigarette advertisement, he's also described as a famous philosopher, as a great teacher, and so on and so forth. So he's not described as, given all these sorts of very nasty racist things that will befall him in North America. Here he doesn't look particularly Chinese, I don't think, but this is another depiction of Confucius, again used to sell cigarettes. And there's a large, extensive series of images. Sometimes they're flowers, sometimes they're birds, sometimes they're places, famous figures, all kinds of things. In this chocolate card, Confucius is described as like an educator, somebody who promotes morality and ethics and education, as a benefactor of humanity. Also, you see the unusual Chinese characters down here and Western style books. In the back, you'll find one of the gates that exist in the Guozijian, in the Imperial Academy in Beijing. This was recreated for one of the many like international expositions, like World's Fairs in Europe in the late 19th century. And if we turn this around, sure enough, if we look on the other side, we can see that this got a gold medal at one of these expositions in 89 and 1900. So Confucius and the gate, the architecture of the Confucian temple, would have been known to the people of Paris because they would have seen a reproduction of it created in Paris for them. This is this little meat card, or this card that would have been sold with this Liebig products, which is kind of a meat sauce, a Worcestershire sauce. There's a series of like 6 images of the life of Confucius that becomes used for marketing for this Worcestershire sauce company. This is the figure where you see the statue or the image of Confucius with this little protuberance from the head that is described in Han text, accompanied by his 2 little Buddhist friends doing this little pitch pot game. There are other 5 other images in the series, one of which is this, where Confucius, here with this kind of freaky hairstyle, encountering the madman Jie. He encounters this madman Jie, and Jie says, like, give up on governance. It's all like waste of your time. Confucius wants to get out of his chariot to discuss with Jie, but Jie like goes off and leaves. In this image, you can see a combination of sort of Arabian, maybe camels in the back, and Chinese stories from the time of Confucius. I don't know that there are that many camels in China and in Shandong province at that time, but this is a common thing to have happen in early 20th century in the US. Combinations of Chinese and Arabian literature published at the same time, and camels in depictions of the life of Confucius. Just a few more, and then I'll be able to give you some time for questions. In the 20th century, we can also see Confucius at war, Confucius at peace, and Confucius used in other kinds of ways. For China and the Allies, Chufu became Chufu as a place, and Confucius is Chufu and Chufu is Confucius, becomes a symbol of resistance against the Japanese Imperial Army during the Second World War. We can also see how for the Japanese military, Chufu was a symbol of cultural domination and subjugation. I'll show you how that plays out visually. There's a series of cards called the Horrors of War cards, which is a nightmare collection of horrible things that happened during war. And there are hundreds of them. This is like number 198 of, I think, maybe 400 little collectible cards published around 1938. This is one that depicts the Chinese army taking back Chufu from the Japanese Imperial Army here. So this is the Japanese Imperial Army being chased by the Chinese forces that are now going to take Chufu back. This obviously is not Chufu, it's the temple, the Dachengdian in Chufu. But this terrain in the back is obviously not Chufu. But here, Chufu represents the Chinese homeland that has been at once occupied, but then liberated from the Japanese Imperial Army. It was liberated from this group here. This is a postcard. It was meant to be sent home during the Japanese occupation of Shandong in the Second World War. And here we see a Japanese soldier on the wall at Chufu, looking over the great temple of Confucius here. There's a little inset here of some of the shrines within the temple of Confucius. And he has his foot on literally the homeland of Confucius. It's a very polluting act to put your foot on top of something. And it shows that the Japanese Imperial Army now controls the homeland of China, homeland of Confucius. The text at the top here will tell us that. It says that this is from Shandong. This is the Chinese Imperial, or the Japanese Imperial Army in this place associated with the figure of Confucius. So Confucius becomes a symbol of resistance against the Japanese for some, and there's a movie called Confucius that's interpreted as that. To the Japanese, he's somebody who is represents the fact that they've dominated China. To the Western Allies, Confucius also becomes interpreted as a peacemaker. There's a famous Polish artist called Arthur Szyk. He was an anti-Nazi Jewish painter who did a number of images associated with peace. In this particular image, which was created or published in 1957, this Polish author creates an interpretation of the Daxue, the Great Learning, and he interprets it as a cry for peace with righteousness in the heart. This is their translation. There'll be beauty in the character, beauty in the character. There'll be harmony in the home, harmony in the home. There'll be order in the nation. With order in the nation, there'll be peace in the world. And it's attributed to Confucius. The imagery is the imagery of medieval manuscript illumination. So you have angels, this man here presenting his heart, different colors of flowers representing the different nations of the world. So all of this symbolism of multiculturalism, multinationalism, everybody working with one another towards a great peace becomes associated with the figure of Confucius, with this particular artist, Arthur Szyk. Then I'll just show you a number of these different Western images. Confucius is also depicted as a founder of a religion. He's still understood or misunderstood as this, even in scholarship today. This is part of a set of cards that depicts Moses and Jesus and the Buddha and Muhammad. Confucius looks like, I don't know what here. Interesting yellow hat, interesting robes. People dressed kind of as Burmese Buddhist monks in the back. So I'm not really sure what to make of this. They're going over some sort of a Chinese bridge. So this is just one of the many different ways Confucius was understood. This dates probably to the 70s in the West. He's also depicted as a man of mystery, a solver of mysteries, somebody with super magical powers. And this image from the 1930s is the Shadow magazine, which comes out twice a month. There's a mystery, The Cup of Confucius, a complete mystery novel. And there's a ton of this kind of stuff where Confucius is depicting as having magical powers, magical powers. He's dressed as a Arabian genie, and he's able to predict your future, tell your fortune, do all sorts of kinds of magical kinds of things. Here, Confucius is able to prophesy what will happen to you in 1999. He's one of history's greatest seers, along with Nostradamus and other figures. He's also depicted as a playboy in the West and in North America. A lot of these weird things become associated with him, sort of whole divination thing, the magic thing. A lot of the stereotypes and the sexualization that North Americans or Americans had about the immigrants who are coming from China to live, especially in California and New York, as we'll see, all this become projected onto Confucius. So in the early 20th or mid 20th century, you have this book of off-color jokes called Confucius Say. Confucius is dressed as kind of like a Chinese official. He often has dark skin. And here he's depicted with a woman in a state of undress that would be considered pretty racy for the time. There are a lot of these kinds of really little off-color jokes in which Confucius is depicted as being a particularly kind of like Donald Trumpian figure in terms of his ideas about the opposite sex. Within that book, you can see that somebody has put together some like random Chinese characters that seem to be just taken from the top of a Chinese newspaper that say like, such and such an issue. There's lots of the pictures of Confucius as kind of a Chinese official, usually with women in bathing suits and with off-color jokes. There's a whole book of these. So Confucius is a playboy, and he's also depicted as a chef. He's especially good at Cantonese cuisine. Many immigrants into America were from Guangdong. And in the mid 20th century, you'll find lots of different ways in which Confucius, delectable dining, becomes associated with restaurant ownership. So you see Kung Fu with the dragon boat image, just sort of generic Chinese stuff. Finally, an accurate Chinese character. It's associated with Cantonese cuisine and late snacks in California. You'll find similar kinds of things in restaurants in New York. That's Confucius at this old China restaurant, which uses one of these more well-known depictions of Confucius from the Jing. More recently, Confucius becomes understood as a genius or a teacher. The Chinese people are understood to be, I guess, particularly intelligent. So then Confucius also becomes particularly intelligent. In this series of babies called brainy babies, Confucius is depicted stereotypically as like with a Fu Manchu mustache and with the color red, which becomes associated with Chinese thought or Chinese culture. He becomes associated with teachers of Garfield and Snoopy, for example. So this is how he enters popular culture in the 80s, 1980s. One of the weirder depictions of Confucius is actually from the late 20th century from China, in which you have a mixture of Russian and Chinese depictions of Confucius, where Confucius actually is modeled on the figure of a Russian Orthodox patriarch. So if we leave North America and then go back to China to look at more unusual depictions of Confucius, and this is just about the last one, just a few more, we can see a combination of Russia from the 1500s and 1600s, a figure called Hermogenes, and 1860, painting of Hermogenes, and China, the late 20th century during their Cultural Revolution. This is a painting by a Russian painter called Pavel Chistyakov, who lived in the 19th century, early 20th century. And this depicts an image called Patriarch Hermogenes This is Patriarch Hermogenes. He's a Russian Orthodox patriarch of Moscow, Hermogenes of Moscow. And here he's being confronted by a Polish invader. This Polish invader wants Hermogenes to sign this document here to sign over power to the Poles, that Poles are Catholics. And so, of course, they're rivals to the Russian Orthodox Church. So this man is dressed in red. His arm is pointing angrily down at this document. He's got a sword here, nice sash around him, looking angrily at this figure of Patriarch Hermogenes, who's looking up to the light, to divine power, and he's putting out his hand saying, no, I will not sign. So in this particular image, this figure is the good guy, and this figure is the bad guy. He's meant to be understood that way. So this is a story that took place, an incident that took place back in the 1600s, early 1600s, but it was painted in 1860. Now, I don't know if this, I can't prove definitely that this is the model for Robert Jur that we see in endless images during the Cultural Revolution. But I've come across secondary sources that say Pavel Chistyakov was known in China. I came across this connection when I was teaching a course in Eastern Europe on comparative Soviet and Chinese propaganda. So if you look at some of the ways in which this figure of Robert Jur, who appears in the Cultural Revolution, he appears actually in the Zhuangzi as somebody who is making fun of Confucius. And this figure of Robert Jur is here depicted as this brave, muscular man, again with the sword, with a nice sash, berating this little figure of Confucius, who's depicted as this wizened figure who's cowering in fear in this case. So what are some of the parallels between these two figures? Here we see this invading Polish general dressed in red, the red cape, the sword here, pointing angrily, at this case, the thing to sign, here pointing angrily at Confucius. There's a lot of iconographic parallels between these figures. This figure of Confucius is commonly depicted this way in Cultural Revolution art. The figure of Hermogenes, on the other hand, Hermogenes is depicted with this long white beard, dressed all in dark colors, and seems to have parallels visually with the image of Confucius that appears in a lot of different Cultural Revolution images. So again, it's impossible to say that this particular image by Chistyakov inspired a lot of these depictions of Robert Jur, but I think you can note some of the parallels for sure, and some of the ways in which this was going on. Finally, Confucius, after the Cultural Revolution, gets reformed in many different ways in China, and he's used as the international man of the world to show the genius of China throughout the world. So Confucius is no longer this despicable figure who's being criticized for being slave holding evil ways, but he's now a genius who stands up there with Einstein and Beethoven and all these other kind of figures. So in 2000, Confucius, who's here, he's depicted as a genius among equals on the world stage. So you have Beethoven, Copernicus, Galileo, all sorts of figures from the world stage who are here. And of course, Confucius is at the center of them. He looks very old now, much older than we saw him in some of these earlier pictures. But now he represents Chinese genius on the world stage. He also is depicted as not necessarily a speaker of Esperanto, but the life of Confucius. This is a traditional series of images from the life of Confucius that were popular in the Ming. They become translated into Esperanto so that all of the people in the world can now know all of the wonderful things about the life of Confucius. So this is a collection of this what's called Shengqi Tu, or Life of Confucius kind of literature. So now my time is running out a little bit. So I'll just recall here that I've tried to throw at you all kinds of different images of Confucius, so that every age has its own Confucius, as Gu Jiegang said. And at each age, there are several different kinds of Confuciuses. They're all created and recreated, constructed and deconstructed, and how they are depicted represents the figments, the creations of our own imaginations. This is true also of text, and we can take this understanding of images also to different kinds of text, the commentaries and the text that we read in philosophy classes, there are also constructions that tell us something, not so much maybe about the original sort of source for that particular text, but about the person making the commentary themselves. So I think I'll end this here and give you a chance to ask some questions. There's a lot out there and pretty fast pace. So if you have questions or and I guess there's some commentators also who will help with these understanding these images. So thanks very much, everybody. Thanks for your patience and looking through these images, and hope you enjoyed them. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Sommer. I think just the sheer range of depictions of Confucius that you included in this talk is striking. And we'll have a lot to talk about in this second part of the session. The first commenter I would like to introduce is Daniel Sarafinas. Dr. Sarafinas is currently postdoctoral fellow at East China Normal University with an expertise in the intellectual history of early Confucianism and also a growing reputation as a translator of contemporary Chinese philosophy. So, Dr. Sarafinas, I will now turn it over to you.
Thanks, Tim. Can you hear me? I have new headphones here. Okay, great. Well, thank you, Tim, and also thank you, Professor Sommer or Deborah, if I might. That was really a very fascinating presentation about, we might call it the image of Confucius. And I mean, I have several questions to you personally, but what I might kind of give to the audience in general. One of which is sort of surrounding the idea of Confucius rather as a historical figure, but as sort of an image or a presentation that thereby gets sort of filled with meanings or values or whatsoever. I'm wondering if Professor Sommer, if there's any through line, so to speak, that you can read through all these multiple representations of Confucius, or if he's merely kind of a receptacle of values that through every age kind of gets projected, sort of the image of Confucius, so to speak, gets projected with the values of that time. Or if there's, I don't know, if there's, so for example, even in classical Chinese thought, Confucius is kind of presented in a multitude of ways, right? So in some instances, for example, the Analects, he's presented as a proponent of ritual over ritual punishment. Whereas in the Chunshou Duozhuan, for example, he's shown praising Ziqian as somebody who like knows how to use punishment correctly, right? So I'm wondering if you have any insight into this, or if any of the people attending might have responses to the idea of in what way does Confucius, the figure, serve as a through line, if at all, throughout his historical representations?
Do you want me to comment on that now, or do we want to open it up to questions from the responses from the audience first? I don't know how you.
If you have,
yeah, I mean,
yeah.
Sorry, I would let Tim take care of this as the proctor, so to speak.
Yeah, if you have a quick response, Professor, we would encourage you to share it now.
I would like to think that there was some sort of through line, but I would have to say that not really. Maybe the Analects is, but then the Analects gets interpreted in so many different ways as well. I think that the variety of, I would emphasize the variety and sort of the openness of Confucius as being just sort of a cipher in which you can sort of deposit all sorts of different kinds of meanings. In the Mantic literature, the Apocrypha, Confucius's body is depicted as a sort of microcosm of the entire cosmos. Whereas in the Cultural Revolution, he means just the enemy. And the enemy could be anybody. So you have everything in between. So I would emphasize the variety. I would like to think that the through line would be the Analects, but I would have to say the evidence, at least in this kind of popular culture that I'm looking at, wouldn't support. I mean, there's the whole, the regular traditional commentarial tradition. You'll find continuity there, more continuity there, the through line of, the teachings of the Analects. But in the kind of materials that I'm looking at, the visual world, anything goes, basically. It's very open, I would say. So you could distinguish, the textual commentary tradition on the one hand versus a lot of this visual stuff on the other. It's quite remarkable the differences that are created. Like where would you get the notion of Confucius as a homicidal maniac from? Well, I mean, there are passages, in I think in the Mozi where Confucius kills people and things like that, but that gets developed in the Dunhuang materials. But I would emphasize the variety rather than the one thread that runs through it all.
All right.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Dan. Go ahead.
No, I think you brought up something very interesting when you mentioned like the Cultural Revolution. So at least from like Liang Qiqiao or Yi Baixia, Confucianism as a sort of socio-political construct was definitely considered, I don't know, I would say maybe destructive to the national history of China, so to speak.
Oh yeah.
And to what extent do you tie the figure of Confucius itself as opposed to Confucianism as a political system to that? Because you mentioned earlier about sorry, I'll let you continue. Yeah.
In the Cultural Revolution?
Or not necessarily the Cultural Revolution, but from, let's say, the mid-19th century, where Confucianism was considered kind of the reason why China stagnated throughout history. So to what extent was Confucius as a historical figure, would you say, was tied to that whole system of quote-unquote Confucianism?
I think in the 20th century, Confucius, from look at these images, he becomes associated with imperial power, especially through the site of Chufu. Chufu is one of the largest collections of imperial buildings outside of Beijing. So in the imagination of a lot of people, Confucius is imperial power. Of course, that's a very different kind of Confucius than you'll find in the Analects itself. But I think that's where he becomes just a symbol of imperial power. So when the Cultural Revolution launched, the first thing that Mao Zedong and others did was to send Tsinghua University students to the Dachangdian, to the Confucian temple in Chufu, to destroy it, to destroy the image of Confucius, to desecrate it, to disembowel it, to take it out on the street and put a dunce cap on it, drive it around the town, and then throw it in a ditch and burn it. So he went to Chufu to do that. I think that he was picking up on that imperial wealthy association with Confucius in the way that was constructed, that movement was constructed. He didn't pick up on any of the other understandings of Confucius. There were some understandings of Confucius as a common man. This is from the 1930s. There was one interpretation of Confucius as just an ordinary everyday person who was just doing ordinary everyday things. That interpretation was not nearly so popular, well, in the Cultural Revolution anyway, as the image of Confucius as a man of imperial power who was, killing children and stealing children from their mothers so that for various kinds of reasons. But the propaganda during the Cultural Revolution is just overwhelming in terms of the way that it depicts Confucius as the kind of a Satan, the great Satan, who is responsible for all the evils of the world. So
All
that politicized Confucius was a creation of the 20th century. Or not just the 20th century, but also just as Confucius ritually became loftier and loftier in terms of his titles. He was a king, and then he became kind of an emperor, and he got more diadems as he went along. Ritually, he became associated with that order. The rites to Confucius were also one of the few ritual systems that survived the fall of the imperial system in 1911, the rites to Confucius for a whole host of reasons, some of which are accidental. That was the one that survived. So he became also a symbol of everything traditional in that sense. The rites to heaven and earth, those and all the other rituals of that system had been pretty much cast aside, but the ones to Confucius remained. So he became this sort of visible symbol of this old system that was depicted as being useless, worse than useless.
All right, thank you, Dan, for your comments, and thank you, Professor, for your response. Before we open it up to general questions, we have one more commenter, Professor Jing Hu. Professor Hu is currently assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at Concordia University in Montreal. Her research centers on the intersection of Chinese philosophy and moral psychology, with a special focus on the role of moral emotions such as shame and empathy. Professor Hu, thank you. And now I will turn it over to you for your comments.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tim. And then thanks for this wonderful talk that really opened my eyes to a lot of the, different depictions of Confucius. Even though I worked on Confucian philosophy for a long time, I have to say I'm not familiar with so many of the ways that he was seen and how he actually represent an enemy or mysterious representation of the Orient or something like that. That's really eye-opening. I think I'm going to make a very short comment / question. I think I entirely agree with this quote from Gu Jiegang saying that there are different kinds of Confuciuses in different age and then perhaps for different people. But it also seems that sometimes there's a difference between who is the person doing the depiction and for whom the depictions were made, namely the audience of such depiction. And I'm not unfamiliar with the sentiment that some would say, well, if the potential audience is this audience, then it's a cultural reimagination within a culture itself. Whereas if the audience is it's an entirely different audience, right? And they have no knowledge and no knowledge of Confucius or anything that's Chinese culture at all. They're just using it as a token to represent anything mysterious or anything they want to put in it. Obviously, people would think that's more problematic. Even though I think the picture is more complicated than that, so I would like to push on that a little bit and then probably ask Professor Sommer to explain that a little bit more, because obviously people, I think in China would be pretty happy to see when Confucius was depicted as a peacemaker, even though it wasn't really based on much of the textual support, right? But it's something nice, it's flattering, right? Then on the other hand, even when it is based on some of the problems within the Confucian tradition itself, it could be elevated to a certain status, not for the sake of the culture itself, but to impress people supposedly all over the world, right? Like the picture you are showing from the middle school in Zhengzhou, right? The purpose is to show that there's Confucius, there's Einstein, there is Beethoven, right? They're there basically to say that we together with all the other nations, with all the other cultures, we contribute all these geniuses to humanity. So I wonder if the audience, like who are the target audience and who is exactly doing the depiction, how does that affect all these different types of image of Confucius, and then what kind of theoretical significance does that have? Thank you.
Oh, there are so many different depictions of Confucius. I think I could point perhaps more specifically to the Cultural Revolution. There were certain directives that came down from the government that images had to be depicted in a certain way to produce a certain desired like emotional result. For example, there are depictions of small children, for example, capturing like bad people. These bad people were like the enemy. And so there'll be depictions of children, cartoon, like 连环画, these small cartoon or manga books, depicting children going out in the evening and catching bad people. We don't really know exactly why they're bad. We just know that they have dirty minds. But there are requirements that the children have to be depicted in a certain way. You have to depict the children as being bigger than the bad guy. And you have to depict the children also always as being victorious. And if you did not produce them that way, then you had to change the edition of that book so you could show that the children were more powerful than the purported enemy. So there are very powerful government directives, especially in 1974, a movement to criticize Confucius and criticize Lin Biao. Why even criticize Lin Biao in 1974 when he'd been dead for 3 years? The politics of that, I think, are, I mean, they're difficult to fathom. They're just attempts to make certain political points by people whose agendas really are not at all clear. The desire to control things in such a way, such a megalomaniac way, sort of almost.
Can I jump in? Actually, my question was more about, for example, if we're comparing that how Confucius was depicted in the 70s or 60s in the West, right? As this one figure that somehow just represents everything that's Chinese or China or mysterious, right? In particular ways, versus, you know, let's say this Chinese restaurant, right, owned by this Cantonese family, and then they use Confucius' name as a way to try to make people associate them with, you know, something good, authentic Chinese food. That's what I meant by, you know, having the different audience and perhaps having the different intention behind depicting Confucius and associate him with Chinese culture. So I was just curious if the target audience in that case would make a difference in whether we think this version, this depiction of Confucius is, I don't know, like authentic or useful, or, you know, is this just cultural appropriation, or is this like a cultural reinvention? So that's kind of my question.
Yeah, I'm not sure what exactly you're asking, like what sort of agency the target audience has for these kinds of images. I don't know how it would be possible to collect any evidence to really be able to say either way what that would be. I'm not sure if I really understand your question, really.
Okay. Well, I was just curious, the audience, since the first few pictures you showed during the late 1990s, like 1980s, were the audience were clearly people in the West. Was some of the other pictures, the audience were clearly people that's under the Confucian culture itself. So that was the distinction that I was going after. And then as the talk was pointing out, some of the depiction were on the line of being, you know, culturally, you know, being racializing or otherwise problematic. So that was my question, the intended audience, if that made a difference in how Confucius was depicted, or how do we look at the way he was depicted in those work?
Yeah, again, in the 20th century in North America, again, you have lots of different voices there. People who want to promote their restaurants and associate with the figure of Confucius as being a learned figure, perhaps, of their culture. And then you have really racist and really sexist images that want to appeal to sort of xenophobic popular culture in America in order to sell these like books of jokes. So you have all sorts of different projects going on, not just one by any means. Yeah, so it's a really complicated question, like how does popular culture work? I don't know how to, to answer that kind of question. You can just look at, what is created that people put out there to try to appeal to an audience, but I don't know if you can really establish exactly what the target audience was thinking or what their motivation was, unless you would find some text, I guess, that would say that they had a particular view, but I don't know where you would find materials for that.
All right, thank you, Professor Hu, for those comments, and again, Professor Sommer. And I think now we can open it up to more general questions from the rest of the audience.
I'll stop the share then. That will work.
Yeah, I think so. I
Yeah.
think so. We can all see each other. Okay.
Do you need to go through the chat, or I'll let you organize it, or?
Yeah, I think either way is fine. You know, if you want to raise your hand or if you just want to type in the chat, either way is fine. Maybe I will ask a question while we're waiting for the audience to see if they have any questions. I'm just curious, you know, is this the fate of kind of any founder and any cultural founder to undergo this kind of variety of depiction with many different interests over time? You know, like there's nothing intrinsic to Confucius that there would be this kind of range of depictions, you know, some of them propaganda, some of them advertising, some of them with a religious interest, all different kinds of interests you see here. But is this just the fate of any kind of founder, or yeah, in your view?
The figure of Jesus, for example, and he's
Sure, that's the first person I think of, right, as maybe also subject to these many different conflicting depictions and interests and so on.
Yeah, with blonde hair and blue eyes, and the Virgin Mary with blonde hair and blue eyes. But yeah, it can happen to any figure in any culture, I would think. Yeah. Do you want me to look through there? I see images in the chat. Slow down my speech. Well, that's too late. The Confucius Temple was finished in 2007. Okay. Someone asked, do you believe it's possible to recover glimpses of the historical Confucius? Well, I mean, in that sections of the Analects, maybe. All you can say is like there's this text called the Analects. If there's some figure called Confucius who said those things that were created in the Analects, I don't really know. The Analects to me just represents a shared body of lore among a certain community of people, and Confucius seems to be the main figure who represents that body of lore that describes primarily the qualities of the Junzi, the person of noble character. And then this person says the character of Shangtuo doesn't appear there, which is problematic. Problematic to whom? Trying to find historical Confucius in those works. Does it have any backing? Well, the character of Shangtuo, I mean, who's to say why Shangtuo became much more popular than, you know, a lot of the other figures? I mean, if you have a child, you want your child to imitate Shangtuo. It's a character that's going to be non-threatening, maybe. I have all sorts of reasons why a 7-year-old figure who's a teacher of Confucius might be a little transgressive or maybe appealing to someone. But it's impossible to say like why certain things happen or why certain figures become popular, because we have such a fragmented understanding of history and historical texts anyway. So Dunhuang shows us this one unusual window, but who knows what else has been lost out there. Sure. But I'll let people raise their hand.
I think, let's see, we have one more. Oh, okay.
I might just ask real quick, Deborah, what about the different ages is really interesting to me, right? That he's depicted sometimes as someone like middle-aged or so, and then sometimes someone older. I don't know if there's more. I'm trying to think of some question about that, but basically I'm just interested, right? So I don't know. My question was going to be something like, I wonder if that like tracks with the commentaries at the time or something else at the time, but I don't even know if that would necessarily be important. I mean, it might, right? But you also might just sort of end up making that up, right? to make it fit. But I don't know. I was just wondering if you could say something about the different ages that he's depicted as, something more. I don't know. I'm just interested.
Yeah, I just, noted that in the Han images and in the earliest Song images that he's depicted as being maybe middle-aged at best,
Yeah.
visually. Then perhaps images in like Song that were influenced by Vimalakirti, maybe. The iconography of Vimalakirti, the older Buddhist figure, whether that influenced depictions of Confucius, I don't know. It's impossible to say again why these things they developed. I think probably the most recent ones. Nowadays he seems to be like really old. I have a suspicion that they're associated with the ways that patriarchal figures were depicted in the Bible. Those images became quite popular in China in the Qing, the late Qing. So I suspect that you can see it on money, for example, where Confucius appears on currency and money. There are parallels between depictions of him and depictions of different patriarchs in the Bible at the time. But it's hard to say again how that happens. But the world, the visual world is quite different from the textual world in many cases. It's a different story. But why certain things happened, we don't know.
Well, I think since it is past the 10:30 mark, maybe it is a good time to end. So thank you very much, Professor Sommer, for this wonderful talk. And I think there's so much to think about in this talk. So we really appreciated it this morning.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Thanks very much. Let's see you all.
Yeah, see you. Thanks so much.
Bye.